I'd like to welcome everyone. As you know, eBay has research seminars or webinars, depending on the format that we're using. These are held on Mondays, every other Monday, and it gives me great pleasure today to welcome as a speaker who was, up until a couple of weeks ago, everything lining up, planned to come and see us in person, but unfortunately circumstances were such that she had to change her plan. So we've switched to the online format. It is Lora and Viola, who is a professor, a full research professor at the Department of Politics in the Freie Universität in Berlin. She's an American, but she certainly claims to be an adopted Berliner, having lived there for a decade or more. She has a very, very distinguished academic career, not only in terms of her universities of study, which included a PhD from the University of Chicago and also a bachelor's from Columbia in New York, but she's worked in numerous distinguished institutions over the years, including Oxford and Stanford, and having, prior to joining the Freie Universität in Berlin, been in Munich. What we're going to hear about today is a very, very interesting project, a project which has been turned into a book a couple of years ago. It was published by Cambridge University Press, called The Closure of the International System: How Institutions Create Political Equalities and Hierarchies. This book has made a number of waves, in a good way. It's been well recognized, well received, and praised from the scholarly community of IR, scholars working on international relations, also working on international organization and the understanding of the international system and its evolution. To name some of the prizes, one was the Chadwick Alger Best Booker Prize, which is by the International Studies Association, the International Organization Committee, so the best book in the field contributing to the study of international organization. It's also won the Hedley Bull Prize, which of course named after the famous English school scholar, is another very, very prestigious award. She's published numerous articles, but today what she's going to do is for us, talk us through the main arguments and the claims that she's making in the book. She will speak for 35 to 40 minutes, and then of course we will always have a session afterwards for you as the audience to participate. So what I'd like to offer now is a warm welcome to Lora. I will hand the floor over to her, as it were. If you could obviously, if you want to make specific questions that are pertinent to the actual context, if you put them into the chat as we go, but more likely the substantive questions and the issues that you'd like to raise, we'll save them all to the end. But if there is a very small issue of clarification, if you put it in the chat, I will keep an eye on that and try and moderate that through. But as of now, it's being recorded. I would like to hand over to Lora, and please, when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Robert, for that generous introduction, also for the kind invitation to discuss my work with you today. I'm really sorry that I can't be there today with you. Hopefully, we just talked about possibilities of coming in person. Hopefully, we can make that work in the near future. But here we are today. Thanks for coming online. In any case, I'm going to introduce today my recent book, as Robert mentioned, The Closure of the International System. And even though the book has already been published, I'm still developing a number of ideas that it raises. So I'm still very interested in your comments and your questions on it. Now, I brought a few slides along just to keep it a little interesting for you when you look at the screen. Hopefully you can see that. Is that okay, Robert?
It's absolutely fine. We can see it perfectly.
Great. Okay, good. Then I'll start. And I wanted to start actually with the title of the book. The title of the book, The Closure of the International System, is meant to suggest a direct engagement with, but also a critique of what has been called the expansion thesis in international relations. Now, the expansion thesis is most closely associated with the English school, and especially this highly influential book that The Expansion of International Society, edited by Hedley Bull, who Robert just referenced, and Adam Watson way back in 1984. Now, this cover image is from a new edition that just came out with a new foreword by Andy Hurrell, which I think speaks to its continuing influence in the field. But even beyond Bull and Watson and the English school, I think it's fair to say that the expansion thesis, although the term may have been coined by them, encapsulates a more general claim that's present, I would say, in almost all IR theoretical traditions, namely that the globalization of the international system has been a process of international institutions expanding rights, opening up to new actors, and generally becoming more inclusive and democratic over time. Now, in the international institutions literature, which is where I would situate my work, over the last decade or so, there has been renewed interest in the possibility of democratic global governance, and in particular, in the possibility of designing more inclusive, more equal, and more democratic international institutions. So very much in the spirit of the expansion thesis, we have seen influential books like these ones, The Opening Up of International Organizations, Democratic Intergovernmental Organizations, which, the answer there is relatively positive. And then The Globalization of International Society, which is a direct sort of take and update on Bull and Watson's original expansion book that you saw in the previous slide. These books represent the position that, to quote Grigorescu, the general trend over more than a century has been one that has taken international organizations closer to domestic democratic models, including norms of representativeness, equality, and transparency. Now, none of these authors argues, of course, that the trend is complete, but the inequalities that we still observe are seen as leftovers from a less democratic era that will be under pressure to adjust over time. In fact, this is Grigorescu's argument that normative pressure will force the adaptation of international organizations to democratize over time. My book develops what I call the closure thesis as an alternative or counter thesis to the expansion thesis. So the title of the book also contains a second reference, and that is to Max Weber's idea of social closure, which I then combine with the economic theory of club goods to form the closure thesis. The closure thesis, in a nutshell, argues that the history of the modern international system is a series of institutional closures in which institutions such as the ones I study in the book, diplomacy, international law, and international organizations, have worked to narrow and homogenize the numbers and types of political actors who are considered legitimate equal rights holders internationally. The closure thesis is an argument to explain how and why institutions create political equality for some, and how and why creating political equality for some entails also creating some political inequality for others. So I will use my remaining time to unpack the argument, and I'd like to cover the following areas. First, I'd like to start by motivating the research question a bit more. Then I'll introduce the closure thesis, and I'll briefly discuss the empirical terrain of the book before wrapping up with a few implications that we might want to discuss. Before I outline my argument in more detail, let me try to contextualize the core problem or question regarding political equality and inequality in the international system as I see it. So the foundation for the claim that the international system and its institutions have been expanding and becoming more inclusive over time, and the related claim that the institutions of global governance are becoming more egalitarian and democratic, is the idea that the international system is built on the principle of sovereign equality of its members. The principle of sovereign equality, what Royce Smith has called the unquestioned given of the modern international system, is seen to be the leveler of material power inequalities. It's crucial here because it makes states subject of equal political rights despite their obvious material differences. Now, there's a lot that can be said about the principle of sovereign equality, and a lot has been said about it. But one curious thing that I just want to bring your attention to now is that there is no real consensus on when or even whether the principle of sovereign equality, this supposedly unquestioned given, came to be realized. So Martin Wright claimed that the leveling of international society, the general acceptance that all sovereign states are equal, was not achieved until after the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century. According to Barry Buzan, the universal sovereign equality only kicked in after 1945. when it was explicitly included as a foundational principle of the UN Charter. And then others argue that sovereign equality only became a reality after decolonization from the late 1950s to the late 1980s. And of course, post-colonial scholars would strongly contest this view as well. So there's considerable disagreement here, and in fact, I think it's futile to look for the historical moment when sovereign equality became an unquestioned given. We can show as an empirical matter that the principle of sovereign equality was articulated as early as the 17th century, and yet empirically, it is also true that there has not been any moment when the principle of sovereign equality was fully realized in practice. Empirically, what we've seen is that international institutions have regularly institutionalized both political equalities and inequalities. The most prominent example, the most obvious example here is, of course, the United Nations, which grants special rights to the UN Security Council members, even though the Charter is expressly committed to equal rights for all members. So equalities and hierarchies seem to persistently coexist, and that's what motivates my central research question here, which is what explains the persistent coexistence of equality, inequality in the international system, and more specifically, how do international institutions produce these relations of equality and hierarchy? Let me just clarify here that when I speak about equalities and inequalities, I'm referring specifically to the distribution of actors' access to institutional decision-making rights. These are what I call political rights, and I understand them as equal participatory and procedural rights within institutions. When I refer to hierarchies, I'm referring to the stratification of these political rights. So I'm not interested in status inequality, which much of the recent hierarchy literature addresses, or directly material inequality, although I would argue that the distribution of political rights is important, has important implications for the distribution of material resources as well. Now, returning to the question here, I see several possible answers that are at least implicit in the existing literature to try to explain this coexistence of the institutionalization of political equalities and inequalities, or equal and unequal political rights. But let me explain why I think they're problematic and why I developed then an alternative answer. So I think there are at least these three existing arguments. The first one is what we might call the progressivist argument. According to this view, political equalities and inequalities coexist because the promise of sovereign equality has not yet been fully realized. Inequalities that still exist are the result of incomplete progress towards greater inclusion and equality, and that is because of cultural or social political hurdles that still stand in the way of this progress. As those hurdles are overcome, inequalities will diminish. That's the expectation here. I would characterize this as the dominant argument in the literature, and it's anchored in a temporal view of the international system as slowly undergoing a historical progression from a more restrictive and exclusive set of political rights to a system with more extensive and expansive political rights until they are essentially universalized. I see this progressivist teleology as problematic because it relativizes current inequalities as empirically or temporally contingent. They are somehow remnants of a less enlightened past that will eventually be overcome by the progress of time. And it overlooks, as I will argue in a moment, the possibility that there is a structural connection, actually, between equal rights for some and not for others. A second common way of explaining the coexistence of political equalities and hierarchies in the international system is what we can call the justificatory argument. This position argues that the achievement of political equality sometimes requires the institutionalization of inequalities. So the restoration of order, the implementation of rights, the safeguarding of liberty, the creation or stabilization of democracy, and even economic development may only be possible through institutions of global governance that grant certain actors special rights. This is, of course, an argument familiar from many contexts. In the international system, it often takes the form that great powers have special responsibilities that justify their exceptional authority within international institutions. Now, justificatory claims for the persistence of inequality are problematic, in my view, because for a number of reasons, but among those reasons, they legitimate the domination of powerful actors and deny their accountability for these structures of inequality. Now, I don't directly talk about liberalism or liberal internationalism in the book, but I think we could characterize these two arguments, the progressivist and the justificatory, as arguments often made by liberal internationalists. So, for example, we find both of these arguments in John Eikenberry's latest book, A World Saved for Democracy, in which he tries to counter the critique that the US is an illiberal or imperialist power by essentially invoking both these types of arguments. Right? We've made lots of progress, we're just not there yet, and also sometimes, in the name of more equality, we have to have inequality first. Now, there's also a third type of argument, one made more recently, that the international system and its institutions are not equalizing at all, but rather intractably permeated by relations of hierarchy. So the topic of hierarchy in the international system has been notably addressed in this volume by Kissack, where the argument is made that hierarchies are a ubiquitous feature of international politics. We also have seen it in Pouliot's work on international pecking orders, where he powerfully makes the argument that multilateralism is not the great equalizer that we like to think it is. And I've also seen it, for example, in this book by Jonathan Renton, where he argues that hierarchy and not equality is the fundamental ordering principle of the international system. This recent turn to focus on relations of hierarchy, I think, is an important contribution, also corrective to a lot of the literature out there, because it asks us to think critically about the claims that international institutions promote equality and democracy. What I think is problematic here, though, is that these arguments lean towards what appears to be an almost deterministic belief that hierarchies cannot be overcome or that they're all-encompassing. I think this is problematic because international institutions have, after all, allocated rights of representation and participation to certain actors, and the principle of sovereign equality has had some important effects that I think we shouldn't ignore. What these arguments about hierarchy share with the others, though, is an underlying assumption that equality and inequality are somehow incommensurable. And this is an assumption I would like to question. It seems to me that hierarchy is not fully intractable because equalities do develop. And yet, equality also seems incapable of fully overcoming or overtaking hierarchy. Now, I don't want to make a Goldilocks argument here that seizes the middle ground between equality and hierarchy. In fact, in the book, I caution against arguing that sometimes we get equality and sometimes we get hierarchy, depending on when and where we look. What I want to do instead is to focus on how the coexistence of political equalities and inequalities is more than a contingency, but a matter of mutual implication. And this means thinking about equality and inequality not as opposites or as decoupled from one another, but, as I argue with the Closure Thesis, as constitutively and causally connected. And that brings me then to the book's central argument. On the face of it, equality is a notion of universality in that rights should apply equally to a set of actors. The problem, though, is that the precise contours of the equality claim are not clear. Who should be the subjects of a principle if it is to be universal? Are all political subjects equal or just some, and if so, which ones? If all political agents are meant, then who counts as a political agent and who decides? The point is that political equality is always extended based on what I would call closure principles that determine which actors qualify to hold equal rights by also determining which do not. Okay, so I've used the language of closure here. What is closure exactly? So Weber introduces the idea of social closure to explain the process and practices by which a group includes some actors and excludes others from sharing in common goods. This is about how groups form. And groups achieve closure by selectively excluding and including through specific social conventions or rules or practices. These could be, for example, specific attributes like gender or racial characteristics, or adherence to certain norms like democracy, development, or human rights. So there's a set of conventions or practices around closure. What is the purpose of using those? What's the purpose of closure? Following Weber and adding also the economic idea of club goods, I argue that closure allows a bounded group to monopolize common resources. Closure rules, I argue, are socially constructed primarily as a means of securing access to resources. In other words, they act as property rights. And here I explicitly want to join a social and a material logic. What institutions do is create a group of actors who have privileged access to collective resources and who use institutional rules to maintain that privileged access and to manage threats to it. So while closure rules are socially constructed, I see them as primarily a means of distributing property rights rather than primarily a struggle over, for example, social status. And rather than seeing international institutions as providers of global public goods, I argue that international institutions intentionally delimit the scope and content of the public in order to preserve restrictive access to common goods. This argument implies then a constitutive and a causal explanation for how political equality and inequality are mutually implicated in institutional rules. So the constitutive claim first. So institutions constitute certain actors as rights holders through their categories of membership, their categorical rules of membership. These rules constitute members as rights holders, and so they create a formal equality for those insiders and a formal inequality between those insiders and outsiders who don't have rights to access and exert political control over the common goods. In effect, a determination of which actors count as equal before the law, if you will, is at the same time a determination of which actors count as unequals. So consider, for example, the United Nations. The United Nations is often thought of as a universal organization, but it's not really truly universal of all politically relevant actors. The post-1945 IOs almost entirely restrict membership to recognized sovereign states. And this means that states which are not recognized internationally have no access to common goods and no seat at the UN table, such as, for example, Taiwan or Kosovo. It also means that individuals like you or I or other kinds of groups, indigenous groups, civil society groups, have no or very few direct rights or primary rights at the international level and cannot directly access or decide on collective common goods. When we look from this perspective, then, the UN, I think, looks surprisingly exclusive. Now, I don't offer an argument for where the membership boundaries should be drawn, but I do suggest that we need to think more about who international institutions are excluding when institutions claim to be equalizing, because these two claims go hand in hand. This club logic of closure, then, is based on restricted access to resources, which leads then, logically, or forms then my causal claim. So institutional membership is meant to be restrictive, but sometimes international institutions come under normative or functional pressure to add members. When they do, however, we should not necessarily expect inclusion to go hand in hand with greater equality for all, which is, one of the assumptions of the expansion thesis, right? In fact, I argue that inclusion and the extension of formal equality, as it were, generates incentives to impose new political inequalities among members in the form of gradated rights. So you have an extension of certain kind of rights and then a counter movement that gradates internal rights. In particular, when institutions increase their membership to more and more heterogeneous members, their privileged access to collective resources is endangered by decision-making rules that promote procedural equality. So for incumbents, problems of collective action will increase, leading to the under-provision of common goods, and pressures for redistribution away from incumbents will increase. And both are costly for these incumbents who are in the institution, after all, because of the collective goods that they get out of it. The costs of diversifying membership create incentives for incumbent members to implement new modes of exclusion through institutional design strategies that introduce political inequalities or gradation of rights within the institution. So there may be more formally equal members, but their institutional rights, for example, their voting rights, are distributed unequally. And identify three such institutional design strategies that I call assimilative, hierarchical, and exclusive multilateralism. Just very briefly, assimilative multilateralism is when inclusion of new members is conditioned on meeting a narrow set of secondary standards. This is essentially an effort to force conformity, reduce heterogeneity, and promote homogenization of diversity in order to facilitate cooperation and the sharing of collective goods. Next here would be conditionality requirements for members, when new members are required to change their policies, possibly even to the detriment of their interests, in order to conform to the preferences of members. Hierarchical multilateralism deals with the problem of greater inclusiveness, or the challenge for the incumbents of greater inclusiveness, by being formally inclusive while at the same time differentially arrogating political authority to a select group of members. The institutional mechanisms I have in mind here are, for example, special rights for executive authorities, special veto rights, tiered membership, and so on. These mechanisms insulate incumbents from the preferences of the larger membership. They're very common in the traditional IOs that were formed after 1945. The third strategy, exclusive multilateralism, uses institutional rules to limit institutional membership to begin with to actors that meet certain criteria, so that core states can control the group attributes and ensure a degree of preference convergence, sort from the get-go, as it were. The decisions of the group, though, impose externalities on those non-members. An example here would be the G7 or the G20, which I discuss in the book. When I see the G20 not as an expansion of the G7, but rather as a way of reducing the heterogeneity of the IMF. Now, in the book, I outline some conditions under which we're likely to get each of these institutional strategies, which I won't get into here. Instead, I want to briefly talk about the empirical approach. So the book takes a historical sociological approach that looks at the evolution of the international system beginning in early modern Europe through to today. It's divided into chapters that focus on a particular international institution that has been constitutive of system members and membership rights in a given period. So diplomacy in early modern Europe, on the left here, international law in the 18th and 19th centuries, represented here by Grotius and Fattel, and international organizations in the 20th and 21st centuries. Here, a picture of the Bandung Conference, a moment of expansion of UN membership. Now, the book takes a long time horizon, in part because I think the literature that sees a trend towards greater inclusiveness and equality that I cited at the beginning suffers from a presentist bias that looks primarily at the period since 1945 and sometimes only since 1990. So with the help of the long time horizon, I find support for three claims. First, is that international institutions have become more restrictive in their membership when we look over the long durée. The chapters show how international institutions, beginning with the practices of diplomacy, but also through international law and IO membership restrictions, worked to winnow down the types and also homogenize the characteristics of actors, the range of political forms that could claim to be legitimate rights holders internationally. A particular version of the sovereign territorial state is considered legitimate today, but in the past, a wider range of potential political actors, individuals, civil society groups, religious communities, non-governmental organizations, private firms, and so on, at one point or another were rights holders at the international level. Now, a common objection I get to this argument is that the international system, and IOs in particular, have recently opened up to new members and new actors, like civil society organizations. And this is certainly true. But in my view, these exceptions underscore the restrictiveness of the rule to begin with. Non-state actors do not have equal participatory or procedural rights within IOs, and institutions have seen to that over the years. It's a point we can talk about certainly in the Q&A. The second claim is that incumbents have intentionally used these institutional rules to both create rights and to limit rights around access to resources. So in my reading, for example, I see the historical origins of the principle of sovereign equality as an attempt to delineate and restrict the set of actors who can benefit from collective international goods, such as the right to trade, the right to wage war, the right to self-rule, and the right to make treaties, right? All collective goods that are created through international law. Sovereign equality was not only a way to secure rights for some types of actors, but was also intentionally a way to exclude some types of actors, other types of actors from those rights, and even to legitimize their exploitation and domination. And by this reading, international law should primarily be understood as a project of homogenizing differences and protecting privileges of a select group rather than as a project that secures universal rights, as it's often talked about, at least in IR. The third claim is that, to paraphrase a famous article by Downs and Barsoom, the good news about expansion is not necessarily good news about equality. The chapter that looks at IO shows how expansion of institutional membership, for example, in the wake of decolonization, was accompanied by incumbent fears of losing privileged access to common goods and activated attempts to gradate rights in such a way as to mitigate the risks of diversity. Again, the risks being the underprovision of that common good and redistribution. We can see this, I think, clearly where the United States and European countries adapted institutions in reaction to the demands of the new international economic order in the 1970s, a case that I get into in some detail in the book. Where they, the concern really is pretty clearly stated, articulated by the incumbents, right, of what expanding membership means to their access to these collective goods. So it's difficult, in my view, to see here a trajectory of ever greater inclusion and democratization of global governance. Instead, I come to the conclusion that global governance is moving away from universal and egalitarian institutions and towards more selective clubs of common interest, more unequal arrangements within or alongside of formally equal arrangements. So in particular, a trend towards this third category of exclusive multilateralism. Okay, I know I've said a lot so far, and I'm almost at the end of my time. So let me wrap up with by drawing out a few implications that I think the book asks us to consider. First, I think that the book asks us to consider the ways in which the expansion of the international system is based on a politics of sameness and homogenization rather than a politics of difference. So it strives for uniformity rather than universality. If we consider all the actors that could potentially have political rights at the global level, the rationalizing effect of international law and institutional membership rules has been to restrict over time the types of political actors imbued with political rights. Now, there's a lot to be said here, for example, about the absence of rights for individuals or rights of indigenous groups at the international level that still have continuing implications today for the rights of those actors. Second, I think the book asks us to consider the ways in which the publicness of collective goods is endogenous to the rules and design of institutions. Now, the discourse of global public goods, which is fashionable at the moment within IR, and I know there's also a research project here at your institute on public goods. I think within IR, at least, the idea of global public goods obscure the ways in which institutions delimit the scope and the content of who counts as the public to begin with, right? So that most collective goods can be made excludable and rivalrous. Here we can think, for example, of the current discussions surrounding the WHO and what has been provocatively called vaccine apartheid by members of the Global South. Third, I think the book asks us to consider the ways in which equality is the political effect of practices of exclusion and subordination. I have argued that equality and inequality are not zero-sum, but mutually constitutive. And this suggests that we should move away from thinking that the pursuit of equality on its own is sufficient to overcome inequalities. And it calls, I think, instead for a conversation on who gets excluded and unequalized whenever we include and equalize, and whether those grounds and those outcomes are acceptable. Now, I don't develop a normative theory to answer those questions, think about where those lines should be drawn, but I think rather than taking on the argument that the international institutions, international organizations, the international system is expanding rights, we need to think about what that expansion really means for the distribution of rights, both in terms of who gets included and who doesn't get included, and at what cost equalizing comes for other actors in terms of how their rights then may get unequalized or stratified. Okay, so I think I'll leave it there and turn it back to Robert and open up for discussion. And I'm happy to talk about any aspect of this or any other questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Laura. That was super interesting. And it's really provoked quite a lot of thoughts in my mind. I've been taking a lot of notes. I know you can't see very well, but for my birthday the other day, my daughter decided to buy me a huge selection of colored pens, and I've been using them to make wonderfully elaborate notes. I have therefore questions, but of course, as the presenter, moderator, chair, it would be rude of me to step in first, because I would be taking advantage of my privilege, making me probably controlling the rules of the public good, which is to allow us to speak to Laura in the little amount of time that we have. So what I would suggest we do, I've been secretly emailing Helena whilst you've been talking, and I know for a fact that there are two ways in which we can have questions asked. Either if any of our participants would like to activate their microphones, please go ahead, put up your hand, turn on the mic, and you can speak directly. If for any reason you're in a loud place or you want to formulate your question very specifically, we can also accept it in chat. So that's two channels open, by voice or by text, and I will pause whilst someone decides to build up the courage, because I'm definitely not going to be caught hook, line and sinker stepping in with one of my questions straight away. So if we just pause, is there anyone out there who would like to ask, or let me keep an eye on the text, chat? No, nothing in chat, so please, the floor is yours. Here we go. Well, we have one from Sandra. Could you provide examples? Oops, it's disappeared. Let me get it back up on the screen. Could you provide examples of exclusive multilateralism and assimilation? I think this is one of the points that actually, Larry, you said you would come back to in the Q&A. So maybe let's start with that. I mean, to give us a little bit of an elaboration of the way in which you saw your three types of assimilation, hierarchy, and so forth being given with your rich empirical work that backed up the argument.
Yes, sure. Thanks for that question. So, assimilative multilateralism, I understand as asking for a certain kind of conformity to the incumbent preferences before being allowed to enter the group. So, for example, there are many examples of this. I think that we may be more familiar with it at the domestic level, and James Tully's fantastic work has talked a lot about how this works in terms of domestic constitutions, asking for example, indigenous actors to conform to a certain set of norms, to be included in a set of rights. At the international level, you could think, for example, about the G7 and its inclusion or offer of including Russia in the 1990s. So the Russia was very keen after the end of the Cold War to join the G7, and it made numerous attempts. There are new archives that actually document the exchange of letters and communications between Russia and the G7 members. And Russia was very intent on wanting to join a lot of the institutions that existed that it had been obviously not a member of because of the Cold War. And the G7 members continuously asked for certain kinds of policy changes in order to make Russia's policies more conform to the preferences of the G7 members. And it's actually, there's some new work on this that shows that, and obviously there are debates about this at the moment as well with other institutional expansion offers to Russia during the 1990s, but in particular with the G7, there's back and forth where the G7 says, okay, you need to undertake these certain kinds of steps to make your economic policy more in line with our preferences. And Russia says, okay, we'll try to undertake these, and they undertake some of them. And then the G7 says, well, you need to do a few more of these. We're not quite there yet. And it goes back and forth. And as you know, Russia's accession to the G7 takes quite a lot of time. Ultimately, then, after the invasion of Crimea, Russia gets thrown out again of the G7. But this is an example where assimilation is a condition of being able to join the group, and it's not necessarily in the interests, right, or it doesn't reflect necessarily the policy priorities of the state that wants to join. But the point of trying to force this conformity is to reduce heterogeneity, to reduce conflict within the group. So it's essentially a form of exclusion, right, in the sense that it tries to get rid of the diversity that would otherwise be there. Tully very provocatively talks about assimilation as a form of domination and of imposing inequality. It's a very interesting discussion that he has there.
Yeah, so I was going to come in there because I was surprised. I was expecting you to say the European Union. I was expecting you to give this as an example, and maybe I would push that a little bit, because I was wondering, one of the questions I wanted to ask, and this will demonstrate that I'm basically jumping in there. What about regional organizations? I mean, did you look at the development of regional organizations, not only in the sense that as we see them develop in areas that have traditionally been excluded from the universal organizations, for example, in Asia, ASEAN states, and so forth, where they got to create their own set of rules as equals at the moment of foundation, rather than this legacy of not having been at the moment of creation and so forth, which is one of the bases of a hierarchy type framework of privileged few and unprivileged many. And in that sense, maybe going a little bit further, because of course you said at the very beginning of the talk that one of your sort of references was the Hedley Bull and Adam Watson 1984 collective essays. And that, of course, was, in terms of the way the English school saw its research agenda, that was the third part. And it was essentially saying, if I remember correctly, that they were worried that too much heterogeneity was actually going to deteriorate and undermine the system. So they were very much pessimistic in this opening up going too far. So that perhaps does bring us around to, do regional organizations and regions themselves, how do they fit into this puzzle? Because you haven't spoken about any of your examples as really being regionally focused. They seem to be mostly, if not truly universal, then primarily, I mean, the G7 is a kind of very, very selective few, but at the same time, it comes from a place of being part of the original Western alliance that did, of course, create not only the post-45 order, but also intellectually, historically, come from the Westphalian model as well.
Yeah, so I think, you know, the EU is, for many reasons, would be really interesting to look at more carefully in terms of my argument. So why didn't I use the EU example? So I didn't use, so there's about conditionality in the EU, obviously, and EU membership accession. I am not an EU expert, and I purposefully, in the book at least, I purposely talk about international organizations or international institutions with a global reach, or in other words, that have aspirations to a certain kind of universality. So that is my universe of cases, as you might have it. I don't look at regional organizations. Okay, so that's why I didn't talk about the EU. That doesn't mean that's not relevant, obviously. It's just, it wasn't within the scope of the kinds of institutions I looked at. But there are a lot of ways in which you can see parallels here within regional organizations. And one of them is in thinking about the conditionality requirements and the distinctions that are made between the creators of the rules and what you might call the price takers later on, right, who have to conform or meet certain kind of conditionality requirements in order to then be able to join. And the very purpose in the EU, I think the discussion is also quite clear that there is a, you know, a fear of the heterogeneity that might stress the production of these common goods, right? And it needs to be reduced through some of these mechanisms. Another way where I think debates about the EU are relevant here is that, more broadly, there is this debate about deepening versus broadening. deepening versus widening that has accompanied the EU over time, and I think that's also quite relevant here. But I simply haven't focused on regional organizations, so I don't have too much to say about it, except that there is, I think there are important or interesting parallels that would be worth looking at more closely. I'm interested in institutions that have aspire, at least on their own terms, to have something like global reach or universality, because I'm very much interested in this tension between sort of universality and plurality, universality and pluralism and diversity. And I think that also goes to some, at least, of what was at stake in the Bull and Watson, the English school discussion. They talk a lot about solidarism, pluralism, plurality, what this means for the international system more broadly. And I would agree that I think that there is a concern already there about too much heterogeneity and the stress that might put the system under. So I don't really have a normative position, or the book doesn't have a normative position. Although you might say, and I think that wouldn't be sort of a wrong critique, that there is sort of a normative position in the book, and that is that something like pluralism and diversity is to be valued, right? And homogeneity and uniformity instead of universality is problematic. So the question about whether too much heterogeneity is a bad thing and we shouldn't want it, or whether we should prefer systems that value pluralism and diversity, is something that explicitly, at least, the book doesn't take a stand on. Now, what I would agree with, though, is that every group draws boundaries. That's something that we won't escape, right? So there is a sense in which there is an argument made here that, I'm not saying that we need to overcome the dynamic, because it's this constitutive dynamic I talk about, right? It's sort of built into the logic. So whenever we draw group boundaries, right, we will be engaging in something like inclusion and exclusion. We will be trying to sort out the question of who belongs and who doesn't belong, and on what basis. Right? The point that I want to make is not necessarily that we shouldn't want to strive for something like homogeneity, or whether we need to have more diversity in some dimensions. Again, I think it's a normative question, but rather that when we make these choices, when we draw boundaries in certain ways, they have consequences. And simply saying that we're constantly expanding and universalizing, I think, doesn't cut it, because it ignores sort of the other side of the coin, as it were. And so what we need to have is more of a discussion then. If too much heterogeneity will stress the system, well, what kind of heterogeneity is it that's stressful for the system, and what isn't? Right? How should we be drawing those boundaries? What should be, what are ways of overcoming those stressors? And are they legitimate and socially acceptable or not? So that's sort of the awareness of that kind of set of questions that I think we don't talk about enough, that is of interest to me. Not to say that there isn't a value in drawing these boundaries to begin with. Every community does that.
I am going to pose a question which is from Bruno, and there's lots coming. So this is a question that came in firstly from Bruno, who's one of our people connected, and he wrote this. I'm sure you can see it, but I'll read it out just to make it clear. So he first of all thanks you for the presentation. And he writes, do you think that we could say that besides the structure of the institutions, some indexes created by them, like Human Development Index, for example, are used as tools to keep the inequalities? And I asked for an elaboration, and he has, because I was wondering if this meant to do with shifting the focus from the traditional GDP per capita, which clearly hasn't really moved very much, and then you can kind of set a new set of indexes which make the picture look different, and it looks as if states are in a different kind of pecking order or a different set of hierarchy. And he's written, for example, yes, and also keeping the distinction between developed and underdeveloped countries, using the criteria by developed countries, i.e. to maintain the hierarchy. So I think what here is one of the ways in which you're doing it, by using HDI as a universal reference, you're kind of removing one of the most clearly established and sort of deeply rooted binaries or identificational sort of categorizations, which is underneath many of the inequalities. So maybe around that issue here, if you could elaborate on indices and sort of ways of ordering and of presenting data that perhaps keeps the inequalities and the structural hierarchies in position. And then there's a second question which we'll come to from Oscar Fernandez just afterwards. But I'll let you tackle this kind of this topic and thought from Bruno first.
Yeah, so thanks, Bruno, for that thought. I think that you're absolutely right, and I think that there are many sort of dichotomies that we can think of, and there is some interesting work Carolina Fehl and Katja Feinstein, for example, have done some work on this, on how international organizations use these categories as a way of stratifying their members, right? So there is the categorization as such, for example, developed and developing, which is highly debated, right? Also on both sides, right? The developing countries who want to maintain the ability to self-identify so that they have access to certain kinds of goods that they wouldn't otherwise have. In the WTO, for example, the developed countries who don't want that anymore because they're worried that countries like China are exploiting this status to get a special treatment that they shouldn't otherwise get. Right, so there is a clear sense that these categories are doing real work in stratifying the actual rights in these organizations. Then, on top of the categories, there's also the use of these indices as apparently sort of objective markers of these boundaries. So we have the case of the least developed countries with the UN. That's one of the only groupings within the UN, or I think the only group within the UN that is actually formally understood as a group of countries within the UN system that are allocated that status, the formal status. It's allocated on the basis of a number of numerical indicators, and there is a process from, as it's called in the UN system, graduating from being an LDC. Right? You can graduate from the status, and there's a lot of debate about this question. The wording of graduation, right, from being a least developed country, what that means, and what it means also for the distribution of material goods that you can have, and your participation in some of the working groups and committees within these international organizations. So there was, I think, in a very recent conference meeting, a discussion by least developed countries about the inequalities that are imposed both by having the status but also by leaving the status, from graduating as it were, and still being, moving beyond the numerical indicators, but so barely that that country would be sort of kicked out of the special treatment that it would get by having the status of least developed country, and yet be essentially in the same position materially as those that are in the category of least developed country. So, I mean, the use of first of all, the categories themselves, the labels, the status, but also of the numerical indicators, I think has a lot to do with, it has a lot of implications for reimposing inequalities on the membership. And it's complicated in both directions, right? So there are clearly strategic incentives on both sides of developed world, for example, and also developing countries in determining how these boundaries are set. I hope that answers the question, Bruno. I'm not sure. I hope I understood it correctly.
I think that's great, Lauren. And Bruno, if you either want to come in with the microphone or to write some more, there you go. It's done. Great job. So the next question we have, again, I'll read it out and then I'll maybe add a little bit of further elaboration on it, because it was one of the things I was going to ask you. So this has come from Oscar Fernandez, and he asks, do you think the proliferation of multi-stakeholder actors in some fields of global governance, for example, health with the Gavi, or the Global Fund, will push traditional actors, e.g. the WHO, to become more open to non-state actors, or will states prefer to keep their exclusive clubs? And if I might add on to that, I mean, how do you see your work speaking, and in what way would it have a conversation with the work on regime complexity, which is taking off quite extensively, to the point where their argument, I guess, would be essentially that rather than accept that these hierarchies and inequalities may be persistent, pervasive within international organizations, they will simply shift, either regime shift or forum shop, or create with new hybridized forms of governance different ways of getting what they want. So in that sense, does the regime complexity literature suggest that in the 21st century, and I know you said you took a very long historical view at this, are we about to come to a point where actually disenfranchised actors, whether they be state or non-state, are going to simply be able to do something much more imaginative and assertive in getting their specific voice heard, their agenda promoted, and so forth?
Yeah, I think that it's a great topic, and there are like really multiple questions embedded in that. So I think sort of to start, maybe just sort of very basically, there has been a proliferation of these other kinds of actors, right, in international in global governance. So of non-state actors, of civil society organizations, also private firms. So, you know, you mentioned Gavi, the Global Fund. There's also, you know, the role of platforms, for example. There is also, and I think you're pointing to this as well, not only regime complexity, but some people are calling hybrid complexes that include many different kinds of transnational actors besides states themselves. So I think that's happening, right? But a few things to note. First of all, they're not that, and you know, Jonas Talberg and his team has written this wonderful book, really, the opening up of international organizations that I had the picture on earlier. It's not that that's not happening, right? But they're not; those organizations are not rights holders at the international level. They have not acquired political rights within international organizations or the international system on the par with states. They have no direct say in the institutional complexes that we see where global governance decisions are being made. Now, that doesn't mean they have no influence in global governance or over global governance, right? So you might say, well, you know, I'm looking at the distribution of formal rights within the institutionalized formal rights. That's what I'm interested in. And I think those are very important. You could say, well, you know, those aren't so important anymore. There are so many actors that, you know, work outside of those institutions that formalized rights aren't important anymore. Well, that might, you know, that's an interesting argument, I think. And it might be that the international system is moving away from the importance of these formal rights. But I do think that they're still central to how the international system works. So international law, for example, or the institutional rules within an international organization like the WTO are still really highly consequential for global governance, and that's at the end of the day still the place where those institutions have bite, as it were. So even though there is this move to more actors and they are more active, I think that we have to see the limitations of the system when we look at the extent to which they actually haven't acquired any rights. And related to that, I think it's interesting to see that as, for example, international law or international organizations have adjusted to these new actors, as international law, for example, has tried to also open up to providing more rights to individuals, or as the UN has very recently tried to do, enhance the representation of indigenous peoples at the UN, for example. I think these are really interesting examples of how international law and international organizations have had to correct for the distortions of exclusion that they have imposed. So it's just to sort of look at it the other way around, right? The reason we're getting a lot of these dynamics is because of those distortions of exclusion that I was talking about initially, and the sort of evening out, right, hasn't really happened yet, and I expect that it won't really happen in terms of the institutionalization of these formal political rights for all of these actors. And just finally, then one question is, okay, so what's the future? I don't know what the future is. I would never, it's just too difficult to predict anything, especially nowadays. But I do think that you might you might argue that one of the ways to overcome some of the dynamics that I've been talking about is to think about the loosening of these categories of membership, categories of that determine the dimensions of inclusion, exclusion. I think we might argue that deterritorialization is of authority is one way that might happen, and that I think is one way to label the kinds of dynamics that you were talking about, regime complexity or hybrid complexity. And just very finally on that, I don't know though if that solves all the problems, because we will, what about those other actors? And this is a normative question that I don't address, and I don't really have the answer to, but there are other actors that might have influence on global governance, that we might not think of as a normative improvement, as it were, right? Not the civil society actors, but the large corporations, the accumulations of capital that may push the system in a particular direction, without any formalized rights, again, as it were, or without being states. So the deterritorialization of authority might work in both directions.
Thank you. So, I mean, just to clarify, of course, if you look at Morse and Keohane, the work on contested multilateralism and some of the earlier regime complexity, it was always, not exclusively, but those particular authors were thinking about states. So basically the emerging powers. So that's how I imagined it to be sort of addressed, as within formal states, interstate, international organizations, and how those members who are the ones that have perhaps felt most disenfranchised or unsettled and unhappy with the status quo. But aside from that, I'm going to read the next question, and you'll be able to see it on your screen, but it's from David D'Amico. What is it exactly that intensifies hierarchy, political orders, or capitalism-based political orders? Does the anarchy of the international system open the door to ego's interpretation of alter that allows for the acquisition of a more collectivist consciousness? So I'm not going to paraphrase that. I'm just going to put it right out there and let you make of it what you will, Laura. It's over to you. Very eloquent, concise, detailed question.
Okay, well, I'll see if I can provide an eloquent, concise, and detailed answer. Okay, thanks, David. I think, one of the things that I'm very interested in the book, and I think that you could argue that it's not as well developed in the book as it should be, is the role of property actually in being one of these closure mechanisms. So what I would like to do is really combine the social political dynamics with the material logic, as I said in the talk. And what I mean by that is I think that there are that we're talking about political orders, and we're talking about the distribution of political rights, and I think that those are constructed and they're socially given, and they also change over time. But the dynamic of closure, of inclusion, exclusion for the purposes of monopolizing resources is a structural one, as it were, that continues over the course of the system, and that is driven by the centrality of property, essentially, and that comes in the form, in different forms. It comes in the form of territoriality, for example, for most of the system, and I tried to argue that even in the beginnings of our post-1945 system, you see this very strongly. In fact, even more strongly. Now, I just said, in answer to the previous question, that we might be seeing a deterritorialization, which maybe means a shifting of property rights away from control over territory towards other things, more directly capital. But I would argue that controlling resources, rules that control access to resources, which you might call property rights, and the centrality of the accumulation of property is sort of the underlying driver of the dynamic here, and it shapes the political order, and the political order itself becomes constructed through the available norms and rules that we have for finding ways to control and manage the boundaries of access to resources. I hope that that has answered the question, but I would concede that that dimension of that. So I think that's the purpose of closure ultimately, also as it's discussed in the book. But the this dimension, the role of property, is maybe not as elaborated on as it could have been.
Right. Well,
Robert, can I just come back to something you said about the form shifting? So I understood Oscar's question to be about the proliferation of other actors, sort of non-state actors, but you said also, what about sort of new states, but not the traditional established states, but maybe rising powers, right?
Exactly, because within the regime complexity literature, obviously there is the one hand which talks about the higher participation rates of non-state actors and the way in which, for various particular configurations, they may have closer or even parity with certain other state-based actors, depending on what the issues. Clearly, cities and C40, emissions curbing and so forth would be a good example. But I think because within the regime complexity, there is also the part which looks at simply the way states have, when they use exit options or forms of coercive control where they threaten to leave if there's not reform. So this gets back to the sort of status quo versus reform issue, which I found kind of, I don't think you used the word status quo once in your presentation, but it seemed to me almost centrally located, because what is the consolidation of privileged property rights, if not the maintenance of the status quo? So it was more in that, because it can be very state focused when we talk about regime shifting, forum shopping, or this sort of essential contestation of the liberal international order, which has been all we've been hearing about for the last 5 years or so.
Yeah, so I think another way maybe to phrase that is, what are the dynamics in terms of my argument between sort of the in-group and the out-group? And I don't talk directly too much about those dynamics. I do argue that that there is, so I talk very much from the perspective of the in-group that want to maintain, right, their control over the boundaries of the group for the reasons that I said. Now, I also say that there are outsiders or members of the out-group who want to join, right? So there's this law term in neo-Weberian scholarship and social closure called usurpation, that there are actors who want to usurp the group, who want to enter the group somehow, and they make demands on the group. That may not be everyone, who all of the actors that might be politically relevant, not everyone may want to join, but those that do make demands. And in the for the most part, my argument sees the incumbents as having the upper hand on making those decisions at the end of the day. But that doesn't mean that there are no strategies available to the out group or outsiders who are making these demands, right? And one of the strategies available to them are similar to the ones that the in-group has. So, for example, to create their own group, to create their own organization, to engage in counter-institutionalization, as many are calling it today, right? To forum shop, or as Morrison Cohane argue, also just to create new institutions that might rival or challenge existing ones. So I think that that would be perfectly consistent with the kind of argument I made, only that I would add to that I see a big asymmetry here between the strategies available to incumbents and those to outgroups making these demands. So there is, for all the reasons that that have to do with inequality and hierarchy, there is a power asymmetry between those who make demands and those who are able to make decisions about the group itself. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that there are no other alternative strategies available, like creating a new group, right? But they will still, I think, because of the distribution of resources, as it were, they're not necessarily going to be equalized or equalizing. Nevertheless, and I think let's see, I'm in the wrong chat here. Let's see. I think Sandra asked about the examples, right? I didn't talk about exclusive multilateralism, but this would be an example where an outgroup can create their own group, for example, their own institution, create their own boundaries, right? And may be able to present sort of counter-institutionalization strategy against or to put pressure on the incumbents. And so I think that's that's something that does happen. It's completely possible here, but my focus is on the primarily on the incumbents themselves. And I would just to sort of come full circle here, I think that the incumbents react to those strategies of the outgroup. So I would say that, and to give an example of exclusive multilateralism here, the G20 is not so much the attempt of incumbents in the G7 to expand the group to include these new rising powers, but rather to react to the increasing influence of rising powers within, for example, the IMF, but also in their effort, for example, China's effort to counter-institutionalize in other organizations by creating an exclusive institution, the G20, that strategically includes certain actors because they're functionally relevant. At the same time, though, diminishing the influence of the heterogeneity of the larger group, for example, that we might find in the IMF. So I see, for example, that as an attempt to also, from the incumbents, to also push against this counter-institutionalization strategy that outgroups might be using. And I think there are many examples of this. So, for example, within trade, there are many examples of this that I could bring about. For example, the Really Good Friends of Services, which is a group that tried to push forward their preferred trade and services policy by excluding members of the WTO that were problematic and had heterogeneous interests, including China, for example, and Brazil and India.
Okay, thank you very much for the elaboration. I mean, I know we're getting close-ish to the finishing point, which is 3. I don't want to push this sort of for too long, because I mean, long sessions on the internet are never very good. Maybe if I could ask you one last question, provided there's nothing else in the chat that comes up in the interim period, which is, you mentioned already the WTO, and your very last example was from there. So could you therefore talk us through the reconfiguration of the G4 post-2003? So from the established Quad, there was Canada, the EU, Japan, and the US that functioned extremely well from the perspective of developed economies that wanted to liberate trade in their own way, to this obviously very, very different configuration, which was EU, China, and Brazil and India, which was the last two respectively representing very large constituents, which kind of held their hand or tied their hands quite a lot. And I'm thinking, for example, of Nalika's work on this, detailed work about how close it took the WTO to the breaking point. And so in that sense, if you were to give us a kind of a two-minute resume of what happened through the lens of the extensive work that you've done for the book, is it that the EU and the US, the incumbents, really needed those two emerging powers there, India and Brazil, to legitimize it, to keep it going? They came, and there's this expectation they could be socialized, but they couldn't, and there's the whole legacy of past injustices, the Uruguay round, which was never fully paid forward again. So would you be able to elaborate maybe very briefly on what you, from your perspective, your insight tells us about that from 2003 to almost to today, because we're still kind of stuck in that, right? And perhaps even, although you don't do futurology very, very wisely, on that, what do you foresee as coming out of that Quad as what we historically thought of being the motor for trade liberalization? So nice, easy question to end on, right?
Okay, I'll give it a shot there, Robert. So I think that what I argue in the book is that there are two basic reasons to expand a group, and one is functional, and the other is normative. And I think to some extent both of them were operative here in the case of the Quad. There are normative pressures, as Gruevsky, I think, rightly argues about, what does it mean to have more democratic organization, and there are legitimacy concerns after Seattle 1999. in particular, right, the legitimacy concerns about participation and marginalization of the developing world within the WTO. So there were legitimacy pressures there to try to find a way to have better participation and representation of developing countries at the WTO. At the same time, there's a very strong functional dynamic. After, in the early 2000s, the developing world, Brazil and India in particular, and China, obviously, their integration in the global trade regime in terms of their economic participation really shifted, right? There was a qualitative change in the significance of their economic participation in the global trade regime. And that meant that, if you just take one example, global trade and services that I mentioned earlier, is very difficult to regulate and come to some kind of agreement on trade and services without thinking about China and Brazil and having them at the table, right? Because they participate, they export services, they import services to an extent and in a volume that was very different than under GATT. For both functional and normative reasons, we have pressures to expand. And then, obviously, Brazil and India, with the G20 and the G33, they engaged in coalition building that was able to put pressure on the Quad also, but also negotiating pressure. Right? They were able to put pressure because they had bargaining leverage because of the functional change in their economic integration in the world economy. Now, they didn't have sufficient pressure, though, to really come up with a deal, right? They didn't have the bargaining power to actually push a deal through. And what we get, obviously in the Doha round, is deadlock, right? There is no, the developing countries can't really push through their preferred policy options, and the developed world needs to have them at the table. And at the same time, they have very heterogeneous interests and preferences. So again, if we look at a trade and services agreement, very different views on how those should be regulated and what kinds of stipulations should be in the agreement. So what kinds of special treatments, for example, for developing world economies? What about state-owned enterprises in China? What kind of status should they have? These are points of disagreement where preferences really diverge. Now, when the developed world could just agree on their own, they had more interest homogeneity and convergence, and it was easier to reach agreement. But now they had to have these other actors at the table for these functional normative reasons, and you get no agreement. What is the reaction then to that? In my argument, the reaction to that is, so it's not, I wouldn't say it's a matter of socialization at all. It's a matter of heterogeneous preferences and interests, and maybe even values in terms of the role of a market economy in a particular country, right? But we get stalemate and gridlock, as Hale and all call it, but you also get a counter reaction of the incumbents. And what they do is they move out of the WTO as a multilateral universal setting into plurilateral exclusive multilateral settings. That's the dynamic I see. And that's the dynamic I see going forward. So that's why at some point in my talk, I think I also argued, rather than having sort of more universal organizations, more inclusive organizations, I think that the increasing relevance of these heterogeneous interests, they were always heterogeneous, there was always diversity there, but they're becoming more relevant now for making decisions about global governance on various issues, from sanctions to trade to security. As those heterogeneous preferences become more relevant, incumbents have incentives to move into more homogeneous groupings, and they did it with the really good friends of trade grouping in, for example, services. And interestingly, I think that the WTO has been playing now with the idea of what they call joint statement initiatives, and that is, again, the idea of trying to move decision-making into more homogeneous groups of like-minded actors to the exclusion of the broader membership, with the idea of then bringing those agreements back into the broader membership for approval. And so essentially, one of the results I would argue get here is moving global governance to smaller groups of exclusive multilateralism that excludes others from being at the table. That means that when they can't sort of have a say in what happens there. And yet the attempt to have those agreements be re-included in the universal organization, and that decouples, I think, this sort of functional logic of what gets done in global governance from the logic of who gets to legitimate it and who gets to actually give approval to it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So we're right on 10:02. I have seen, let me go back to the chat. No more questions coming up. So I think we've had a great talk from you, Laura. Thank you so much for taking your time today. We will hopefully see you in person at another time soon here in Barcelona. That's always an invitation open. And I said we would come back. We wouldn't do the same again. We do something new, because I know when we talked originally, but conversed through email a month or more ago about what you were going to speak about, I know you have some really exciting new research to talk about as well. So we'll definitely look at that rather than and hopefully contribute there. There's a lot of my colleagues who weren't able to make it today, who've expressed very specifically that they'd love to be chatting with you in general. So what I would like to say is, from the people who are here virtually with us, offer our thanks and gratitude for you to speak to us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I wish you a very happy remainder of Monday. Perhaps to have a snack, because I'm certainly starving. And I'm glad the microphone probably can't hear my stomach rumbling, because it's pushing 3 here, and I didn't have anything to eat beforehand. And we will have the pleasure of meeting sometime in person, I hope very, very soon. But from behalf of everyone here in the audience, thank you for staying with us. Thank you for your questions. I know it's been a very interesting talk, and we'll all see each other sometime soon. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.